The helicopter touched down on the makeshift landing pad with a thunderous roar that shook the entire forward operating base. Through the swirling dust and chaos, a figure emerged from the aircraft carrying nothing but a worn medical bag and credentials that would soon be questioned by the most arrogant officer in the entire theater of operations. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes wear the simplest uniforms, and that pride comes before the fall in ways no one could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Hammurabi, casting long shadows across the compound that housed 300 soldiers in the heart of contested territory. The base sat like a fortress of steel and concrete amid rolling hills that concealed dangers most civilians couldn't imagine. Razor wire gleamed in the harsh light, and watchtowers stood sentinel against a horizon that promised nothing but trouble. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped down from the transport helicopter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. Her flight suit was regulation issue, nothing special, just standard military green that had seen better days. The medical bag slung over her shoulder looked ordinary enough, the kind of equipment any field medic might carry. But appearances, as Colonel Marcus Brennan was about to discover, could be devastatingly deceiving. Chen moved across the landing zone with purposeful strides, her boots crunching on the gravel that had been laid down to prevent the helicopters from kicking up too much dust during operations. She had the kind of focused energy that came from years of emergency medicine, where every second counted and hesitation meant lives lost. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her face carried the calm concentration of someone who had seen more trauma than most people could imagine. From his position near the command bunker, Colonel Brennan watched her approach with the kind of skeptical expression he reserved for anything that didn't fit his preconceived notions of military excellence. He was a man who had built his career on maintaining standards, on ensuring that only the best and brightest served under his command. At 48, he had the bearing of someone who had never doubted his own judgment, never questioned whether his first impressions might be wrong. Brennan had commanded this forward operating base for 8 months, and in that time, he had developed very specific ideas about what real military professionals looked like. They were tall, they were imposing, they carried themselves with the kind of swagger that announced their competence to everyone within 100 yards. They didn't arrive looking like librarians with medical degrees. His aide, Major Williams, jogged up from the communications tent with a clipboard in hand and sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the early hour. Williams was young, eager, and had learned to anticipate his commander's moods with the precision of a meteorologist tracking storm systems. He could tell from the set of Brennan's jaw that the colonel was already forming opinions about their new arrival. "Sir, this is the medical specialist they sent from Landstuhl," Williams announced, slightly out of breath from crossing the compound at double time. "Dr. Chen, reporting for temporary duty assignment." Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly as he studied the woman approaching them. She was perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slender build that suggested she had never spent serious time in a weight room. Her uniform was clean but unremarkable, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who preferred to let their work speak for itself rather than making grand gestures. "This is what they sent us?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that Chen would hear him as she drew closer. "I requested a trauma surgeon with combat experience. What I got was someone who looks like she just finished her residency at some suburban hospital." Chen heard the comment, of course. Sound carried well in the open spaces of the forward operating base, and Colonel Brennan wasn't particularly concerned about discretion. She had heard variations of the same observation throughout her career, from drill sergeants who thought she looked too soft for military service to attending physicians who assumed she had gotten her position through affirmative action rather than merit. She didn't respond, didn't even change her expression, just continued walking toward the command area with the kind of steady pace that suggested she had somewhere important to be and wasn't going to be deterred by casual disrespect from superior officers who hadn't bothered to review her qualifications. When she reached the small group gathered near the command bunker, Chen came to attention with military precision and offered a crisp salute. "Dr. Sarah Chen reporting for duty, sir. I'm here to provide Level 1 trauma support for forward operations." Brennan returned the salute with the kind of lazy acknowledgement that suggested he was doing her a favor rather than following military protocol. He looked her up and down with the expression of someone examining a piece of equipment that might not be up to specifications. "Dr. Chen," he said, drawing out her name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. "I have to say, you're not quite what I was expecting when I requested additional medical support. How much combat experience do you actually have?" The question was asked in the tone of someone who already knew the answer and didn't like what he had discovered. Chen's service record was sitting in a manila folder on Williams' clipboard, but Brennan had barely glanced at it before deciding that anyone who looked like a suburban pediatrician couldn't possibly have the kind of experience needed for combat operations. "I've served in forward positions for the past 6 years, sir," Chen replied evenly. "Most recently in Afghanistan, providing emergency medical support for special operations teams." Brennan's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Special operations teams, right. Let me guess. You patched up some scraped knees and handed out aspirin to guys who were feeling homesick." The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from the junior officers who had gathered to watch the exchange. They had learned that laughing at the colonel's jokes was generally safer than remaining silent, even when those jokes crossed lines that probably shouldn't be crossed. Chen's expression didn't change. She had developed a kind of professional immunity to casual insults over the years, the way some people developed immunity to common viruses. The opinions of officers who judged competence based on appearance had stopped mattering to her long ago. "I'm here to provide whatever medical support you need, sir," she said simply. "My equipment is being unloaded from the helicopter. I can have a temporary aid station operational within the hour." Major Williams glanced at his clipboard, then at Colonel Brennan, clearly sensing that this conversation was heading in a direction that might not end well for anyone involved. He had seen his commander's judgment calls before, and they weren't always as accurate as Brennan liked to believe. "Sir," Williams interjected carefully, "Dr. Chen's file indicates significant trauma experience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She's been recommended for this assignment by Command Medical." Brennan waved dismissively. "Command Medical doesn't understand what we need out here. They think they can send us anyone with a medical degree and expect miracles. What we need is someone who can handle real trauma, not someone who looks like she'd faint at the sight of blood." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigarette. Several of the enlisted men who had been unloading equipment from the helicopter stopped what they were doing and looked up, sensing that something significant was happening near the command area. Chen absorbed the comment with the same calm she had shown since arriving at the base. She had learned long ago that responding to provocations only escalated situations that were better left to resolve themselves through professional competence, rather than verbal sparring. "I understand your concerns, sir," she said quietly. "Perhaps you'd prefer to evaluate my qualifications based on performance rather than appearance." The suggestion was made with perfect military courtesy, but there was something in Chen's tone that suggested she was completely confident in her abilities, regardless of what Colonel Brennan might think about her appearance or demeanor. Brennan's jaw tightened slightly. He had the look of someone who wasn't accustomed to having his judgment questioned, even indirectly. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being able to assess personnel quickly and accurately. The idea that he might be wrong about this quiet doctor was not something he was prepared to consider. "Performance," he repeated, as if testing the concept. "Tell you what, Dr. Chen, why don't you set up your little aid station and we'll see how you handle things when they get real. Because out here, we don't have time for on-the-job training." The dismissal was clear, but Chen simply nodded and moved toward her equipment without another word. She had learned that the best response to skepticism was simply to do the work and let the results speak for themselves. As she walked away, Brennan turned to Major Williams with the expression of someone who had just confirmed his worst suspicions. "I want you to put together a request for a real trauma surgeon. Someone with actual combat experience who can handle what we're likely to face out here." Williams made a note on his clipboard, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that Colonel Brennan's assessment was accurate. He had served long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, and that the military's best professionals didn't always look like they had stepped out of a recruiting poster. "Sir," Williams said carefully, "it might take several weeks to get a replacement. In the meantime, Dr. Chen is what we have." Brennan's expression suggested that what they had wasn't going to be nearly enough when things got serious. "Then let's hope nothing significant happens before we can get someone qualified out here." The irony of that statement would become apparent sooner than anyone expected. Dr. Chen spent the next several hours methodically setting up her medical station in the reinforced bunker that had been designated for medical operations. The space was cramped and poorly ventilated, but she had worked in worse conditions. Her equipment was compact but comprehensive, the kind of gear that could handle everything from minor injuries to major trauma. She worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this setup dozens of times before, checking and rechecking her supplies, ensuring that everything was properly organized and easily accessible. The enlisted men who helped her move equipment noticed that she seemed to know exactly where everything belonged, that she moved with the kind of practiced confidence that came from serious experience. Sergeant Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had seen more combat medics than he cared to count, watched her work with growing interest. He had learned to judge medical personnel not by their appearance or their bedside manner, but by how they organized their workspace and handled their equipment. Dr. Chen, he noticed, moved like someone who had worked under pressure before. "Ma'am," he said during a brief break in the setup process, "you need anything else for the aid station?" Chen looked up from the medical cabinet she had been organizing. "This should be sufficient for now, Sergeant. I assume you have established evacuation protocols for serious casualties." Martinez nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Helicopter landing zone is designated, and we have radio contact with the field hospital at Balad. Standard procedure is to stabilize and transport for anything we can't handle here." "Good," Chen replied. "Hopefully we won't need to use those protocols." The sergeant's expression suggested he wasn't particularly optimistic about that possibility. Forward operating bases in contested territory had a way of generating medical emergencies with depressing regularity. As evening approached, the base settled into its standard rhythm of heightened alertness. Guard rotations changed, patrols prepared for night operations, and the constant background hum of generators and communication equipment created the soundtrack of military life in a combat zone. Colonel Brennan made his evening rounds through the compound, checking on various operations and ensuring that security protocols were being followed. He paused briefly at the medical bunker, where Dr. Chen was making final preparations for whatever the night might bring. "Everything ready, Doctor?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he expected the answer to be negative. Chen looked up from the medical records she had been reviewing. "Yes, sir. Fully operational and ready for casualties." Brennan nodded curtly. "Let's hope you don't get tested too seriously. This isn't exactly the kind of environment where you can call for backup when things get complicated." The comment was clearly intended as another dig at her perceived inexperience, but Chen simply acknowledged it with professional courtesy. She had learned that arguing with superior officers who had already made up their minds was generally a waste of time and energy. "I understand, sir," she said simply. "I'm prepared for whatever situations might arise." Brennan's expression suggested that he seriously doubted that claim, but he didn't pursue the matter further. He had made his opinion clear, and now it was simply a matter of waiting to see whether his judgment would be proven correct. As he walked away from the medical bunker, Brennan felt the familiar satisfaction of someone who had accurately assessed a situation and taken appropriate measures. He had requested a replacement for Dr. Chen, and when that replacement arrived, the base would be properly equipped to handle serious medical emergencies. The attack came at 0347 hours, announced by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds and the immediate chaos of soldiers scrambling for defensive positions. The base's alarm system shrieked across the compound, mixing with the shouts of sergeants ordering their troops to battle stations and the thunderous explosions of ordnance impacting throughout the facility. Colonel Brennan was in the command bunker when the first rounds hit, coordinating defensive responses and trying to determine the size and scope of the enemy force. The attack was more coordinated than usual, with multiple firing positions and what appeared to be a significant number of combatants. "Sir," the radio operator called out over the noise of explosions and automatic weapons fire, "we're taking heavy fire from the north and east perimeters. Casualties are being reported from multiple positions." Brennan grabbed his helmet and weapon, preparing to move to a better observation point where he could assess the tactical situation. The forward operating base had been attacked before, but this assault felt different, more organized and more dangerous than the typical hit-and-run operations they usually faced. As he moved toward the exit of the command bunker, a massive explosion rocked the entire facility. The blast was close enough to knock him off his feet and fill the air with concrete dust and debris. When the ringing in his ears subsided enough for him to hear, he realized that someone was shouting about casualties at the north gate. "Colonel!" Major Williams appeared through the smoke and dust, his uniform torn and blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "The north gate took a direct hit. We've got multiple casualties, including serious trauma cases." Brennan pushed himself to his feet, feeling the sharp pain in his chest that suggested he had been hurt in the blast. "How many wounded?" "At least 6, sir, maybe more. Sergeant Collins is down, and it looks bad." The colonel's jaw tightened. Sergeant Collins was one of his most experienced non-commissioned officers, a 20-year veteran who had served multiple combat tours. Losing him would be a significant blow to the unit's capability and morale. "Get them to the aid station," Brennan ordered, then paused as he realized what he had just said. The aid station was staffed by Dr. Chen, the suburban pediatrician, who probably couldn't handle anything more serious than a sprained ankle. Another explosion shook the compound, this one close enough to shower them with debris from the concrete walls. The attack was intensifying, and there was no time to second-guess medical arrangements that had already been made. "Sir," Williams said urgently, "we need to get the wounded to medical care immediately. Some of these injuries are life-threatening." Brennan nodded grimly. They would have to make do with what they had, which meant relying on Dr. Chen to handle trauma cases that would challenge even the most experienced combat surgeons. He only hoped that his assessment of her capabilities had been wrong, because if it hadn't been, they were about to lose some very good soldiers. The first casualties arrived at the medical bunker within minutes of the initial explosions. Sergeant Martinez and 2 other soldiers carried Sergeant Collins on an improvised stretcher, the wounded man's uniform soaked with blood and his face pale with shock. Dr. Chen looked up from her preparations as they burst through the entrance of the bunker. She had been expecting casualties from the moment the attack began, and her medical station was fully prepared for trauma cases. "Put him on the table," she ordered, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos surrounding them. "I need to assess his injuries." Collins was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Chen's hands moved quickly over his body, checking for wounds and assessing the extent of his injuries. What she found was serious, multiple shrapnel wounds, significant blood loss, and possible internal injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention. "I need blood products and 4 access," she told Martinez, who had remained in the bunker to assist. "And get me the surgical kit from the cabinet." Martinez moved quickly to gather the requested supplies, impressed despite himself by the doctor's calm efficiency. She seemed to know exactly what she was looking for and moved with the kind of practiced confidence that came from serious experience. As Chen worked to stabilize Collins, more casualties arrived. A young private with a compound fracture of his left arm. A specialist with severe lacerations from flying debris. A sergeant with what appeared to be a concussion and possible skull fracture. The small medical bunker quickly became a scene of controlled chaos as Dr. Chen moved between patients, triaging injuries and providing life-saving treatment. She worked with the kind of focused intensity that blocked out everything except the immediate medical needs of the wounded soldiers. Meanwhile, the attack on the base continued to intensify. Mortar rounds impacted throughout the compound, and the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons fire suggested that enemy forces had moved closer to the perimeter than usual. The defensive positions were holding, but the battle was far from over. Colonel Brennan was coordinating the defense from the command bunker when Major Williams approached with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Sir, we have a problem. The medical bunker is taking casualties faster than they can be processed. Dr. Chen is requesting immediate evacuation for several serious trauma cases." Brennan's jaw tightened. The helicopter landing zone was under enemy fire, making evacuation extremely dangerous. They would have to hold their wounded until the attack was repelled and the airspace was secure. "Tell her to do what she can," he ordered. "Evacuation isn't possible until we neutralize the enemy fire positions." Williams nodded and hurried back toward the medical bunker, leaving Brennan to focus on the tactical situation. The colonel pushed aside his concerns about Dr. Chen's capabilities and concentrated on the immediate problem of defeating the enemy attack. But those concerns came flooding back when another massive explosion rocked the compound, this one close enough to the command bunker to crack the concrete walls and knock out several pieces of communication equipment. The blast was followed by the sound of automatic weapons fire much closer than before, suggesting that enemy forces had breached the outer perimeter. "Sir," the radio operator called out, his voice tight with stress, "we're getting reports of enemy infiltrators inside the compound. They've breached the north gate and are moving toward the command area." Brennan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. If enemy forces had penetrated the base's defenses, everyone inside the compound was in immediate danger. The medical bunker, with its wounded soldiers and limited defensive capabilities, would be particularly vulnerable. "Get me a tactical assessment," he ordered. "I need to know exactly where these infiltrators are and how many we're dealing with." The radio crackled with reports from various defensive positions. The picture that emerged was not encouraging. At least a dozen enemy combatants had made it through the perimeter, and they were moving systematically through the compound, engaging defensive positions and threatening key facilities. Major Williams burst into the command bunker with blood on his uniform and a look of desperate urgency on his face. "Sir, we need to evacuate the medical bunker immediately. The enemy is moving in that direction, and Dr. Chen has 6 critical patients who can't be moved easily." Brennan's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. The medical bunker was positioned near the center of the compound, which had seemed like a safe location when the base was designed. But if enemy forces had penetrated the perimeter, that central location made it a potential trap. "How many security personnel do we have available?" he asked, Most of our people are engaged at the perimeter, Williams replied. I can maybe spare 4 soldiers to help with security at the medical bunker. 4 soldiers wouldn't be enough if a determined enemy force decided to target the medical facility. Brennan realized with growing concern that he might have made a serious mistake in dismissing Dr. Chen's capabilities. If she was the only medical professional available to treat their wounded, and if enemy forces were moving toward her position, the consequences could be catastrophic. I'm going to the medical bunker, he decided. If we're going to lose people, I want to know exactly what's happening. Williams looked surprised. Sir, that's not necessary. You're needed here to coordinate the overall defense. Brennan was already reaching for his weapon and body armor. The defense is holding for now. But if we lose our medical capability, we're going to have a lot more problems than tactical coordination. The trip from the command bunker to the medical facility took Colonel Brennan through a compound that looked like it had been hit by a natural disaster. Smoke hung in the air from burning vehicles and damaged buildings. Debris from mortar impacts was scattered everywhere, and the sound of gunfire seemed to come from multiple directions. He moved carefully between positions of cover, using the tactical movement techniques that had been drilled into him during his early military training. The enemy infiltrators were still somewhere in the compound, and he had no desire to become a casualty himself. When he reached the medical bunker, Brennan was shocked by what he found. The small facility had been transformed into something that looked like a field hospital from a war movie. Dr. Chen moved between patients with swift efficiency, her hands covered in blood and her uniform stained with the evidence of serious trauma surgery. Sergeant Collins was still on the main treatment table, but he was conscious now and appeared to be stable. The other casualties were arranged throughout the bunker, each receiving the kind of medical care that Brennan had assumed would be beyond Chen's capabilities. Colonel, she said without looking up from the patient she was treating, I need to know the security situation. Are we expecting more casualties? Brennan stared at the scene before him. The quiet doctor he had dismissed as inexperienced was clearly in her element, providing life-saving medical care under conditions that would challenge the most experienced trauma surgeons. Her movements were precise and confident, and her patients were receiving the kind of treatment that was keeping them alive. We have enemy forces inside the compound, he replied, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. You might need to prepare for evacuation. Chen looked up for the first time since he had entered the bunker. Her face was calm but focused, and her eyes held the kind of steady determination that came from years of working under pressure. These patients can't be moved right now, she said simply. Collins has internal injuries that require ongoing monitoring. The private with the compound fracture is in shock and needs blood products. Moving them could kill them. Brennan felt the cold realization that his tactical situation had just become much more complicated. The medical bunker couldn't be evacuated, which meant it had to be defended. And the person he had dismissed as incompetent was now responsible for keeping 6 critically wounded soldiers alive. How long do you need? He asked. At least 2 hours to stabilize the most critical cases, Chen replied. Maybe longer if complications develop. 2 hours was an eternity in combat conditions. Brennan knew that enemy forces would eventually locate the medical bunker, and when they did, the consequences would be catastrophic. He would have to commit significant resources to defending a position that was difficult to fortify and impossible to evacuate. I'll get you the time you need, he promised, though he wasn't sure how he was going to keep that promise. Chen nodded and returned to her work, trusting that the colonel would handle the tactical situation while she focused on the medical challenges. The division of responsibility was clear, but Brennan realized that he had seriously underestimated the importance of the medical mission. As he prepared to leave the bunker and organize its defense, another explosion shook the compound. This one was close enough to rattle the medical equipment and caused several of the wounded soldiers to cry out in pain. "That was close, Major," Williams said, appearing at the entrance to the bunker with a rifle in his hands and concern written across his face. "Too close," Brennan agreed. "We need to establish a defensive perimeter around this position. Get me every available soldier who isn't engaged at the outer perimeter." Williams nodded and hurried away to organize the defense. Brennan remained in the bunker for a few more moments, watching Dr. Chen work with growing admiration. She had proven herself under the most challenging conditions imaginable, and he was beginning to understand just how badly he had misjudged her capabilities. The sound of approaching footsteps and voices speaking in a foreign language announced that enemy forces were moving closer to the medical bunker. Brennan checked his weapon and prepared to face whatever was coming, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his wounded soldiers survived or died, and whether Dr. Chen, the suburban pediatrician he had dismissed so casually, would prove to be the most important person on the entire base. The distinctive sound of combat boots on concrete echoed through the narrow corridors as enemy fighters moved methodically through the compound, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. Colonel Brennan positioned himself at the entrance to the medical bunker, his rifle trained on the approach route while his mind calculated tactical possibilities that all seemed to end badly. Behind him, Dr. Chen continued her work with the kind of focused concentration that seemed to block out the approaching danger entirely. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she adjusted 4 drips, monitored vital signs, and made the countless small decisions that kept critically wounded soldiers alive. The contrast between her calm professionalism and the chaos surrounding them was striking. "Sir," Sergeant Martinez whispered from his position near the bunker's secondary exit, "I count at least 8 hostiles moving this direction. They're checking every building systematically." Brennan nodded grimly. The enemy force was well organized and methodical, which meant they would eventually reach the medical bunker, regardless of how well it was defended. The question wasn't whether they would be discovered, but when, and whether they could hold their position long enough for Chen to complete her life-saving work. "Time estimate, Doctor?" he asked quietly, not wanting to distract her from the delicate procedure she was performing on Sergeant Collins. "Collins needs another hour minimum," she replied without looking up from her patient. "The internal bleeding is more extensive than I initially thought. If I rush this, he dies." Brennan felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every decision he made in the next few minutes would determine whether 6 wounded soldiers lived or died, whether the base's medical capability survived, and whether the woman he had so carelessly dismissed would get the chance to prove just how wrong his initial assessment had been. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from somewhere near the communications building, followed by shouted orders in English as the base's defenders engaged the infiltrating enemy forces. The battle was moving closer to their position, and time was running out faster than anyone had hoped. Major Williams appeared at the bunker entrance, his face streaked with dirt and his uniform torn from crawling through debris. "Sir, we've got problems. The enemy has split into multiple teams. One group is moving toward the command bunker, but another is heading directly for this position." "How long?" Brennan asked. "Maybe 10 minutes before they reach this building. 15 at the outside." Dr. Chen looked up from her work for the first time in 20 minutes. Her face was calm, but her eyes held the kind of determined focus that Brennan was beginning to recognize as her natural response to crisis situations. "I need those 15 minutes, she said simply. "Collins is stabilizing, but the young private is going into shock. If I don't get him blood products and surgical intervention right now, we're going to lose him." Brennan made the kind of split-second decision that defined military leadership. "Williams, get me every soldier who isn't actively engaged. We're going to hold this position." "Sir, that's going to leave other areas of the base vulnerable." Other areas of the base don't have 6 critically wounded soldiers who can't be moved, Brennan replied sharply. This is where we make our stand. As Williams hurried away to gather defensive forces, Brennan realized that his entire perspective on the mission had shifted. What had started as a routine deployment with standard medical support had become a desperate fight to protect capabilities he hadn't even known existed. Dr. Chen had returned to her work, but now Brennan watched her with different eyes. He saw the way she moved between patients with practiced efficiency, how she prioritized treatment based on medical necessity rather than rank or personal relationships, how she remained calm under pressure that would break most people. The private she was treating couldn't have been more than 19 years old. His face was pale with blood loss, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Chen worked with swift precision, starting another 4-line and preparing blood products that would hopefully keep him alive long enough for more definitive treatment. What's his name? She asked Sergeant Martinez. Private Rodriguez, ma'am. He's been with us for about 3 months. Good kid, always volunteers for extra duty. Chen nodded as she adjusted the flow rate on the IV bag. Well, Rodriguez is going to make it home to see his family. I can promise you that. The confidence in her voice was absolute, and Brennan found himself believing her despite the desperate circumstances. There was something about the way she worked that inspired confidence, a sense that she had faced situations like this before and knew exactly what needed to be done. The sound of approaching enemy forces grew louder, punctuated by occasional bursts of gunfire as the base's defenders tried to slow their advance. Brennan could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize, along with the metallic sounds of weapons being prepared for combat. They're close, Martinez whispered from his position near the entrance. Brennan checked his rifle one more time and positioned himself where he could cover both approaches to the bunker. The defensive position wasn't ideal, but it was what they had. More importantly, it was all that stood between Dr. Chen and the enemy forces that would show no mercy to wounded American soldiers. The first explosion came without warning, a grenade that detonated somewhere near the entrance to the building that housed the medical bunker. The blast was close enough to shake dust from the concrete ceiling and cause several pieces of medical equipment to rattle ominously. Private Rodriguez cried out in pain and fear, his vital signs spiking on the monitors that Chen had connected to track his condition. She immediately moved to calm him, her voice steady and reassuring despite the chaos erupting around them. You're going to be fine, she told him quietly. Just focus on breathing. Let me worry about everything else. Brennan was amazed by her ability to project calm confidence, even as enemy forces prepared to assault their position. She seemed to understand instinctively that her patients needed emotional support as much as medical treatment, especially in combat conditions where fear could kill as easily as blood loss. The second explosion was close enough to crack one of the concrete walls and fill the air with dust and debris. This time, the blast was followed immediately by the sound of automatic weapons fire and shouted orders as enemy fighters began their assault on the building. Contact front. Martinez called out as the first enemy soldier appeared in the corridor leading to the medical bunker. The sergeant's rifle barked once, and the figure disappeared back around the corner. Brennan moved to a position where he could support Martinez while still maintaining oversight of the bunker's other entrance. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Chen continued her work as if nothing unusual was happening. How much longer? He called out over the noise of gunfire. Rodriguez is stabilizing, she replied, her hands moving quickly to adjust his treatment. But I still need to check on the others. Collins is showing signs of internal bleeding again. The woman's dedication to her patients was absolute, Brennan realized. Even with enemy forces literally at the door, she was focused entirely on providing medical care to soldiers who depended on her expertise for their survival. It was the kind of professional commitment that he had always respected in theory, but rarely seen demonstrated so clearly in practice. Another burst of automatic weapons fire echoed through the corridor, followed by the distinctive sound of a grenade explosion. The enemy was using explosives to clear defensive positions, which meant they were serious about taking the building regardless of casualties. "Sir," Martinez called out urgently, "they're bringing up heavy weapons. We're not going to be able to hold this position much longer." Brennan's mind raced through tactical possibilities. The medical bunker was located in the center of the building, which provided some protection from direct assault, but also meant there were multiple routes the enemy could use to reach them. Defending all those approaches with limited personnel was going to be nearly impossible. "Doctor," he said, "I need an honest assessment. How long do you absolutely need to get these soldiers stabilized for transport?" Chen looked up from Sergeant Collins, her face serious but determined. 30 minutes for basic stabilization. An hour if you want them to have a reasonable chance of surviving transport to a field hospital. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours given their current tactical situation. Enemy forces were already in the building, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the medical bunker. Brennan realized that he was facing the kind of impossible decision that defined combat leadership: risk everything to save everyone, or accept losses to minimize casualties. "We'll get you the time you need," he promised, though he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. The next several minutes passed in a blur of gunfire, explosions, and the constant tension of expecting enemy fighters to appear at any moment. Brennan and Martinez held their positions at the bunker entrances while Chen moved between her patients with the kind of focused efficiency that seemed to accelerate under pressure. She worked on Private Rodriguez first, stabilizing his blood pressure and ensuring that the fourth lines were secure. Then she moved to Sergeant Collins, checking his surgical sites and adjusting his pain medication. Each patient received the kind of careful attention that would have been impressive in a peacetime hospital, let alone a combat zone under direct attack. "Ma'am," one of the wounded soldiers called out weakly, "are we going to make it out of here?" Chen looked up from her work and smiled with genuine warmth. "Absolutely. I've been in worse situations than this, and I've never lost a patient yet. You're all going home." The confidence in her voice was infectious. Even Brennan found himself believing that somehow they would find a way through the current crisis. There was something about Chen's absolute commitment to her patients that made impossible things seem achievable. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Multiple sets of boots were moving through the corridor outside the bunker, accompanied by voices speaking in urgent, clipped phrases. The enemy had reached their floor of the building. Martinez signaled for silence and positioned his rifle to cover the main approach. Brennan moved to support him while trying to maintain awareness of the bunker's other potential entry points. The concrete walls that protected them also limited their visibility, making it difficult to track enemy movements. A shadow appeared at the edge of the corridor, followed immediately by the distinctive outline of an assault rifle. Martinez took the shot without hesitation, and the figure collapsed with a sharp cry of pain. But the gunfire had revealed their position, and now the enemy knew exactly where they were. "Grenades!" Brennan shouted as he saw the distinctive shape of an explosive device arc through the air toward their position. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the medical bunker. Concrete dust filled the air, electronic equipment sparked and failed, and several of the wounded soldiers cried out in pain and terror. But when the dust settled, Chen was still working, her hands steady as she checked her patients for additional injuries caused by the explosion. "Everyone okay?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the ringing in everyone's ears. Brennan was amazed by her composure. A grenade had just exploded less than 20 feet from her position, but she was more concerned about her patients than her own safety. It was the kind of selfless dedication that defined the best military medical professionals. "Rodriguez needs oxygen," she announced, moving quickly to adjust his breathing support. The blast aggravated his lung. Injury. Private Rodriguez was struggling to breathe, his face pale and his lips showing signs of oxygen deprivation. Chen worked with swift efficiency, adjusting his ventilation and monitoring his vital signs with the kind of focused attention that blocked out everything else happening around them. More enemy fighters appeared in the corridor, moving with the tactical precision of well-trained soldiers. Martinez engaged them with controlled bursts of rifle fire, but Brennan could see that they were outnumbered and outgunned. The defensive position that had seemed adequate was rapidly becoming untenable. "Doctor," he called out, "we may need to move these patients sooner than planned." "Moving Rodriguez right now will kill him," she replied without looking up from her work. "His lung is partially collapsed and his blood pressure is barely stable. He needs at least 15 more minutes. 15 minutes that they probably didn't have." Brennan made rapid calculations based on the enemy's rate of advance and the defensive resources available to him. The math didn't work out in their favor. That's when Major Williams appeared at the bunker entrance, breathing hard and carrying a radio that crackled with urgent communications. "Sir, I've got good news and bad news." "Bad news first," Brennan replied, not taking his eyes off the approaches to their position. "The enemy has reinforced their assault team. We're now looking at approximately 20 fighters in this building alone, and they're moving systematically through each floor. And the good news? Air support is inbound. Apache helicopters with authorization to engage any hostile forces in the compound. Estimated time of arrival is 12 minutes. 12 minutes was better than nothing, but it still left them with a significant gap between current circumstances and effective support. Brennan realized that everything depended on their ability to hold their position for just a few more minutes. "Can you get us additional defensive support?" he asked. Williams shook his head grimly. "Everyone else is engaged at the perimeter. We're dealing with a coordinated attack on multiple fronts. This position is on its own until air support arrives." Dr. Chen looked up from Private Rodriguez, her face showing concern for the first time since the crisis began. "How long can you hold them?" Brennan met her eyes and saw the kind of direct, honest question that deserved an equally direct answer. "Maybe 10 minutes. Probably less if they decide to use heavy explosives." She nodded and returned to her work, but now her movements were even more focused and efficient. She was racing against time in the most literal sense possible, trying to complete life-saving medical procedures before enemy forces overwhelmed their position. The next assault came with overwhelming force. Multiple enemy fighters appeared simultaneously at both approaches to the bunker, supported by automatic weapons fire that forced Brennan and Martinez to take cover behind whatever protection they could find. Bullets ricocheted off concrete walls, filling the air with deadly fragments and the sharp smell of cordite. Medical equipment that had survived the grenade blast was destroyed by rifle fire, and several of the wounded soldiers cried out as they were hit by debris. But through it all, Dr. Chen continued working. She moved with the kind of calm efficiency that seemed to exist in a bubble separate from the chaos surrounding her. When rifle fire shattered the 4-bag connected to Private Rodriguez, she immediately replaced it with a new one. When Sergeant Collins began showing signs of shock from the noise and violence, she administered medication to stabilize his condition. "Martinez is hit," the sergeant called out, his voice tight with pain. Brennan looked over to see that his defensive partner had taken a round in the shoulder. Martinez was still conscious and still fighting, but blood was soaking through his uniform and his shooting was becoming less accurate. "How bad?" Brennan asked. "I can still fight," Martinez replied through gritted teeth, "but I need medical attention soon." Dr. Chen appeared beside Martinez without anyone seeing her. "Move." She carried a small medical kit and worked with swift efficiency to assess his wound, while rifle fire continued to echo through the corridor. "Clean through and through. she announced after a quick examination. "Missed the major blood vessels. You'll live, but you need to sit down before you pass out." She applied a pressure bandage with movements so quick that Brennan almost missed them, then returned to her other patients before Martinez could even thank her. The entire treatment had taken less than 30 seconds, but it had been performed with the kind of skill that would have impressed trauma surgeons in peacetime hospitals. "Ma'am," Martinez said quietly, "I think I owe you an apology." "For what?" Chen asked, checking Private Rodriguez's breathing. "For thinking you didn't belong here." She looked up and smiled. "You're not the first person to make that mistake. You won't be the last." The sound of approaching helicopter engines interrupted their conversation. The distinctive whop-whop of rotor blades grew louder as Apache gunships moved into position over the compound. Within seconds, the building shook with the concussion of 30mm cannon fire as the helicopters engaged enemy positions throughout the facility. "Air support is engaging," Williams reported over his radio. "Enemy forces are pulling back from multiple positions." The change in the tactical situation was immediate and dramatic. The sustained gunfire that had been directed at their position stopped abruptly as enemy fighters found themselves under attack from above. The sound of running footsteps indicated that hostile forces were retreating from the building. "How much more time do you need?" Brennan asked Dr. Chen. 5 more minutes for Rodriguez," she replied, her hands working steadily to complete his treatment. "Then we can start moving patients to the landing zone." 5 minutes that now seemed achievable thanks to air support that had arrived at exactly the right moment. Brennan allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic for the first time since the attack had begun. But his optimism was premature. The sound of a much larger explosion shook the entire building, followed immediately by the ominous creaking of structural damage. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and several wall-mounted cabinets crashed to the floor. "What the hell was that?" Martinez asked. Williams was already on his radio, requesting status reports from various positions around the compound. When he received his answer, his face went pale. "Sir, the enemy detonated a vehicle-borne explosive device near the main support column for this building. The structure is compromised. We need to evacuate immediately." Dr. Chen looked up from Private Rodriguez, her face showing the first sign of real concern since the crisis had begun. "He's not ready to be moved. His lung could collapse completely if we transport him now." Brennan felt the terrible weight of command settle on his shoulders once again. The building was structurally compromised and could collapse at any moment. But moving critically wounded soldiers before they were medically stable could kill them just as surely as falling concrete. "How long do we have?" he asked Williams. "Engineering assessment says maybe 10 minutes before the building becomes unsafe. Could be less if there are additional explosions. 10 minutes to complete medical procedures that required 15. The math was still impossible, but now failure meant not just losing patients to medical complications, but potentially losing everyone to structural collapse. That's when Dr. Chen made a decision that would define her professional legacy and prove, once and for all, just how badly Colonel Brennan had misjudged her capabilities. "I'm going to perform an emergency thoracostomy," she announced, her voice calm but determined. "It's risky, but it's the only way to stabilize Rodriguez quickly enough for transport." Brennan had heard the term before, but wasn't sure exactly what it meant. "What does that involve?" "I'm going to insert a chest tube to prevent his lung from collapsing during transport. It's normally done in a surgical suite with full support, but we don't have that luxury." The procedure she was describing was clearly complex and dangerous, especially under current conditions. But the alternative was accepting that Private Rodriguez would die either from his injuries or from the building collapse. "What do you need?" Brennan asked. "Just hold him steady and keep everyone else calm," Chen replied, already preparing her instruments. "This is going to hurt, but it will save his life." For the next 8 minutes, Colonel Brennan watched Dr. Chen perform emergency surgery under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced trauma surgeons in the world. She worked with her hands steady despite the building shaking around them, her concentration absolute despite the chaos and danger surrounding their position. Private Rodriguez remained conscious throughout the procedure, his face tight with pain but his eyes focused on Dr. Chen's calm, reassuring presence. She talked him through each step, explaining what she was doing and why, providing the kind of emotional support that was just as important as the medical treatment. "Almost done," she told him as she secured the chest tube that would keep his lung inflated during transport. "You're being incredibly brave, Rodriguez. Your family is going to be so proud when they hear about this." When she finished, Rodriguez was breathing easier and his vital signs had stabilized significantly. The emergency procedure had worked, transforming him from a patient who couldn't be moved into someone who could survive transport to a field hospital. "That's it," Chen announced, stepping back from her work. "He's ready for transport." Brennan stared at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. She had just performed emergency surgery in a collapsing building while under enemy fire, and she had done it with the kind of skill and confidence that belonged in medical textbooks. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." She looked up from packing her medical equipment, her face showing mild surprise. "For what?" "For everything I said when you arrived. For doubting your qualifications. For requesting a replacement." Chen smiled, but there was no trace of smugness or vindication in her expression. "Colonel, you made reasonable assumptions. Based on limited information, it happens to everyone." "No," Brennan replied firmly. "What I did was inexcusable. And what you just did was extraordinary." The building shook again, more violently this time. Structural damage was becoming more severe, and they needed to evacuate immediately. But as they prepared to move the wounded soldiers to safety, Brennan realized that his understanding of military professionalism had been fundamentally changed. Dr. Chen had proven herself under the most challenging conditions imaginable. She had saved lives that would have been lost, performed procedures that seemed impossible, and maintained her composure when everything around her was falling apart. And she had done it all while being dismissed and doubted by a superior officer who should have known better. The evacuation of the medical bunker required coordination that would have challenged experienced disaster response teams under ideal conditions. With a structurally compromised building, critically wounded patients, and ongoing security threats, it demanded the kind of improvisation that separated professional military personnel from weekend warriors. Dr. Chen moved between her patients with systematic efficiency, preparing each one for transport while continuously monitoring their vital signs. Private Rodriguez, now breathing steadily thanks to her emergency thoracostomy, was conscious and alert despite his ordeal. Sergeant Collins remained stable but required careful handling to prevent further internal bleeding. "Martinez, I need you to coordinate with the helicopter crews," Brennan ordered, despite the sergeant's shoulder wound. "Make sure they understand. We have critical patients who need immediate transport to Landstuhl." Martinez nodded and reached for his radio, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his injury. The Apache gunships had cleared the immediate area of enemy forces, but medical evacuation helicopters would need secure landing zones and clear flight paths to operate safely. Major Williams appeared at the bunker entrance carrying additional medical supplies that had been salvaged from other areas of the compound. "Doctor, I brought everything I could find. Plasma, additional 4 fluids, and some surgical instruments that survived the explosions." Chen accepted the supplies with professional gratitude. "Thank you, Major. These will help during transport." She quickly assessed what had been provided and integrated the useful items into her portable medical kit. The building shook again, more violently than before. Chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling, and one of the remaining fluorescent lights flickered and died. The structural damage was accelerating, and they had perhaps 5 more minutes before the facility became completely unsafe. "Transport status?" Brennan asked into his radio. "Dust off is inbound," came the reply. 2 Black Hawks configured. For medical evacuation, estimated arrival in 3 minutes. Landing Zone Alpha is cleared and secure. 3 minutes to move 6 critically wounded soldiers from a collapsing building to a helicopter. Landing zone 200 meters away. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a routine operation, but these circumstances were anything but normal. Dr. Chen had finished her preparations and was now focused entirely on the logistics of patient transport. "Collins and Rodriguez need stretcher teams with medical monitoring," she announced. "The others can be moved more quickly, but everyone needs force support during transport." Sergeant Martinez, despite his wound, had organized teams of soldiers to carry the wounded. Each team had been briefed on handling patients with specific injuries, and backup personnel were standing by in case complications developed during the evacuation. "Ma'am," one of the stretcher bearers asked Chen, "what do we do if someone's condition deteriorates during transport?" "Stay calm and keep moving," she replied without hesitation. "I'll be monitoring everyone continuously. If there's a problem, I'll handle it." The confidence in her voice was absolute, and Brennan realized that her patients trusted her completely. They weren't just receiving medical care from Dr. Chen. They were under the protection of someone who had proven herself capable of performing miracles under impossible conditions. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as the medical evacuation aircraft moved into position over the compound. The distinctive whop-whop of rotor blades mixed with the ongoing sounds of structural damage as the building continued to deteriorate around them. "Time to go," Brennan announced. "First team, move out with Collins." The evacuation proceeded with military precision. Each patient was carefully lifted and transported through corridors filled with debris and past walls that showed ominous cracks from structural damage. Dr. Chen moved alongside the stretcher teams, monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatments as needed. Private Rodriguez remained conscious during his transport, his eyes focused on Dr. Chen's reassuring presence. The chest tube she had inserted was functioning perfectly, keeping his lung inflated and allowing him to breathe normally despite his other injuries. "You're doing great, Rodriguez," she told him as they navigated around a pile of concrete rubble. "Just keep breathing steadily. We'll have you at a real hospital in no time." The young soldier managed a weak smile. "Thank you, ma'am. I thought I was going to die in there." "Not on my watch," Chen replied with quiet determination. "I told you everyone was going home, and I meant it." Colonel Brennan walked alongside the evacuation procession, providing security oversight while observing Dr. Chen's continued care of her patients. Even during transport, she maintained the same level of focused attention that had characterized her work throughout the crisis. When they reached the helicopter landing zone, 2 Black Hawk medical evacuation aircraft were waiting with their rotors turning and medical teams standing by. The aircraft were configured specifically for critical care transport with advanced life support equipment and flight medics trained in trauma care. "Dr. Chen?" One of the flight medics called out as the first patients were loaded. "I'm Sergeant Thompson. I'll be taking over primary care during transport." Chen quickly briefed Thompson on each patient's condition, treatment provided, and ongoing medical needs. The handoff was seamless, demonstrating the kind of professional competence that allowed military, medical personnel to function effectively across different units and specialties. Rodriguez had an emergency thoracostomy performed approximately 15 minutes ago, she explained, indicating the chest tube. "Vitals are stable, but monitor for pneumothorax. Collins has possible internal bleeding. Last vitals were stable, but watch for signs of hemorrhagic shock." Thompson nodded as he absorbed the information. "Understood. Anything else we should know?" "They're all fighters," Chen replied simply. "Take good care of them." As the helicopters lifted off with their precious cargo, Brennan felt a profound sense of relief mixed with something that might have been pride. 6 soldiers who had been critically wounded in enemy action were now en route to definitive medical care, alive because of Dr. Chen's extraordinary skill and dedication. But the immediate crisis wasn't over. The building that had housed the medical bunker was still structurally compromised, and there were other wounded soldiers throughout the compound who needed medical attention. Dr. Chen's work was far from finished. "What's our casualty status base-wide?" Brennan asked Major Williams. Williams consulted his notes. 14 wounded in total, including the 6 we just evacuated. The remaining 8 have minor to moderate injuries that can be treated here. "Doctor," Brennan said, turning to Chen, "I know you've been through hell, but we still have soldiers who need medical care." Chen was already gathering her remaining medical supplies. "Where do you want me to set up a new aid station?" Her willingness to continue working, despite everything she had already endured, was remarkable. She had performed emergency surgery under enemy fire, saved lives that would have been lost, and coordinated a complex medical evacuation. But she was ready to keep going as long as soldiers needed her care. "The communications bunker is structurally sound," Williams suggested. "It has adequate space and power for medical operations." "That works," Chen agreed. "I'll need help moving the remaining medical equipment." As they organized the relocation of medical operations, word of Dr. Chen's performance during the crisis began to spread throughout the compound. Soldiers who had witnessed her work under fire shared stories of her calm competence and life-saving procedures. The woman who had been dismissed as inexperienced was rapidly becoming a legend. Corporal Davies, one of the soldiers who had helped carry stretchers during the evacuation, approached Brennan with obvious excitement. "Sir, is it true that Dr. Chen performed surgery in the bunker while we were under attack?" "It's true," Brennan confirmed. "She saved Private Rodriguez's life with an emergency procedure that I've never seen performed under combat conditions." Davies shook his head in amazement. "Man, when she first arrived, some of the guys were saying she looked too soft for this kind of work. I guess we were wrong." "We were all wrong," Brennan replied, the admission carrying more weight than Davies probably realized. The new medical aid station was operational within an hour, and Dr. Chen resumed treating the remaining casualties with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Each patient received careful evaluation and appropriate treatment, regardless of the severity of their injuries. Specialist Morrison had suffered a concussion from a mortar blast and was experiencing severe headaches and nausea. Chen performed a thorough neurological examination and prescribed medication to manage his symptoms while monitoring for signs of more serious brain injury. "How long before I can return to duty, ma'am?" Morrison asked. "Let's focus on getting you feeling better first," Chen replied. "Head injuries need to be taken seriously, especially in combat environments where you need to be thinking clearly." Her approach to patient care was comprehensive, addressing not just immediate medical needs, but the longer-term implications of injuries sustained in combat. She understood that soldiers needed to trust their own capabilities before they could effectively return to duty. Private First Class Jackson had sustained multiple lacerations from flying debris during the enemy assault. The wounds weren't life-threatening, but they were extensive and required careful cleaning and suturing to prevent infection and minimize scarring. "This is going to take a while," Chen warned as she prepared to suture the largest laceration. "But I want to do this right so you don't have problems later." Jackson nodded gratefully. "Take your time, ma'am. After what you did for Rodriguez and the others, I've got complete confidence in your work." The comment reflected a fundamental shift in how the soldiers viewed Dr. Chen. She was no longer the questionable replacement who didn't look like she belonged. She had proven herself under the most challenging conditions imaginable and earned the kind of respect that couldn't be taught or faked. As Chen worked on Jackson's injuries, Colonel Brennan found himself reflecting on his own performance during the crisis. He had made tactical decisions based on sound military principles, but his assessment of personnel had been fundamentally flawed. The consequences could have been catastrophic if Dr. Chen hadn't been far more capable than he had assumed. "Colonel," Major Williams said quietly, joining Brennan near the entrance to the new aid station, "I've been thinking about what happened today." "What about it?" "When Dr. Chen first arrived, I had some doubts myself. She didn't fit the image I had of what a combat trauma surgeon should look like. But watching her work today, I realized that my image was wrong." Brennan nodded slowly. "We both learned something important about making assumptions based on appearances." "Yes, sir. But more than that, I think we learned something about what real professionalism looks like under pressure." The Major was right. Dr. Chen had demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that defined the military's best professionals. She had remained calm when others panicked, focused when others were distracted, and competent when competence meant the difference between life and death. As evening approached, the immediate medical crisis at Forward Operating Base Hammurabi was largely resolved. The seriously wounded had been evacuated to appropriate medical facilities. The remaining casualties were stable and receiving proper care, and security had been restored throughout the compound. But for Colonel Brennan, the real reckoning was just beginning. He had made fundamental errors in judgment that could have cost lives, and those errors needed to be acknowledged and addressed. More importantly, he owed Dr. Chen an apology that went far beyond the brief words he had offered during the evacuation. "Doctor," he said, approaching her as she finished treating the last of the wounded soldiers, "when you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you privately." Chen looked up from her notes, her face showing mild curiosity. "Of course, Colonel. I'm just finishing up here." They walked together to a quiet area near the command bunker, away from the activity and noise of ongoing recovery operations. The compound was returning to normal, but the events of the day had changed something fundamental about how people viewed each other and their capabilities. "Dr. Chen," Brennan began, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I said. Earlier, when you arrived at this base, I made assumptions about your qualifications based on your appearance and my own preconceived notions about what a combat surgeon should look like." Chen listened without interrupting, her expression calm and professional. "Those assumptions were not just wrong," Brennan continued. "They were inexcusable. You have proven yourself to be one of the most capable medical professionals I have ever had the privilege to serve with. The soldiers whose lives you saved today owe you a debt that can never be repaid." "Colonel," Chen replied quietly, "I appreciate your words, but I was just doing my job. The same job I've been doing for 6 years in forward positions like this one." "No," Brennan said firmly. "What you did today went far beyond anyone's job description. You performed emergency surgery under enemy fire. You saved lives that would have been lost. You demonstrated the kind of courage and competence that defines the very best of military service." Chen considered his words carefully before responding. "I understand that my appearance doesn't match what people expect from someone with my qualifications. I've dealt with that throughout my career. But I've learned that the best response to skepticism is simply to do the work and let the results speak for themselves." "You're right," Brennan acknowledged. "And today, your results spoke louder than any words could. But that doesn't excuse my failure to give you the respect you deserved from the moment you arrived." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Martinez, who approached them with obvious purpose despite his bandaged shoulder. "Excuse me, sir, but I wanted to thank Dr. Chen personally." "Of course, Sergeant." Martinez turned to Chen with an expression of sincere gratitude. "Ma'am, I've served with a lot of medical personnel over the years, but I've never seen anything like what you did today. You saved Rodriguez's life, you kept Collins stable, And you managed to treat everyone else while we were under direct attack. It was extraordinary. Chen smiled warmly. Thank you, Sergeant. How's your shoulder feeling? Much better, thanks to your quick work, but that's not why I'm here. Martinez paused, choosing his words carefully. When you first arrived, I'll admit I had doubts. You didn't look like what I expected from someone with your supposed qualifications. I was wrong, and I wanted you to know that. I appreciate that, Sergeant, but you weren't the only one who had doubts. It's natural to make assumptions based on limited information. Martinez shook his head. Maybe, but that doesn't make it right. What you did today proved that real competence doesn't always look like what we expect. I'll remember that lesson for the rest of my career. As Martinez walked away, Brennan realized that the events of the day had taught important lessons to everyone at Forward Operating Base Hammurabi. Dr. Chen had proven herself beyond any doubt, but she had also demonstrated something more important about the nature of professional competence and military service. Doctor, he said, there's something else I need to tell you. Before the attack, I had submitted a request for your replacement. I thought we needed someone more experienced, more suited to combat operations. Chen's expression didn't change. I assumed as much. It's not uncommon when commanders have concerns about personnel assignments. I was wrong to make that request without giving you a chance to prove yourself. And after today, I can't imagine having anyone else responsible for medical operations. At this base, I appreciate that, Colonel. But you should know that I've never taken assignments like this personally. I understand that commanders need to have confidence in their personnel, especially in combat situations. Her professionalism was absolute, even when discussing the disrespect she had experienced. Brennan realized that Dr. Chen's character was as impressive as her medical skills, and that his initial assessment had been wrong on multiple levels. There's one more thing, he said. I want to recommend you for recognition of your performance today. What you did deserves to be acknowledged at the highest levels. Chen considered the offer carefully. I appreciate the gesture, Colonel, but I didn't do anything that any competent trauma surgeon wouldn't have done under the same circumstances. No, Brennan replied firmly. What you did was extraordinary, and it needs to be recognized as such. The soldiers whose lives you saved deserve to know that their sacrifice was honored through proper recognition of the person who kept them alive. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Williams, who approached them with a radio message in hand. Sir, I have an update from Landstuhl Medical Center. Go ahead, Major. All 6 patients arrived safely and are receiving definitive care. Private Rodriguez is stable and expected to make a full recovery. Sergeant Collins is in surgery, but the prognosis is good. The medical team specifically asked me to convey their compliments to the surgeon who performed the initial treatment. Chen's face showed the first sign of real emotion since the crisis had begun. Relief, satisfaction, and perhaps a touch of pride flickered across her features before being replaced by her usual professional composure. Thank you for letting me know, Major. That's the best news I could have hoped for. Ma'am, Williams continued, the trauma surgeon at Landstuhl said that Rodriguez's emergency thoracostomy was performed perfectly. He said whoever did that procedure under field conditions demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment. Brennan felt a sense of vindication that had nothing to do with his own performance. Dr. Chen had been proven right not just by her immediate results, but by the professional assessment of her peers at one of the military's premier medical facilities. As they prepared to return to their respective duties, Brennan reflected on the profound changes that had occurred during this single day at Forward Operating Base Hammurabi. The attack had been repelled, casualties had been minimized, and normal operations would soon resume. But the lessons learned would last much longer. Dr. Chen had proven that competence came in many forms, that appearances could be deceiving, and that the military's best professionals didn't always look like they had stepped out of recruiting posters. She had demonstrated grace under pressure, skill under fire, and the kind of dedication to duty that defined the very best of military service. More importantly, she had taught everyone at the base something about the danger of making assumptions based on preconceived notions. The quiet doctor who had been dismissed as inexperienced had proven to be exactly the kind of professional they needed when everything went wrong. "Dr. Chen," Brennan said as they prepared to part ways, "I want you to know that it has been an honor to serve with you. What you did today will be remembered long after both of us have moved on to other assignments." Chen smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Colonel. It's been my privilege to serve with soldiers who were willing to risk everything to protect their wounded comrades. Today was a reminder of why I chose military medicine as my career." As she walked away toward the medical aid station where soldiers were still receiving her care, Brennan realized that he had witnessed something rare and valuable. Dr. Chen hadn't just saved lives during a crisis. She had demonstrated the kind of professional excellence that inspired others to be better at their own jobs. The attack on Forward Operating Base Hammurabi would be recorded in official reports as a successful defense against enemy forces. But for the people who had been there, the real story would be about a quiet doctor who had proven that heroes didn't always look like what people expected, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought not with weapons, but with skill, dedication, and an absolute refusal to give up on the people, depending on your expertise. Private Rodriguez would return to duty months later with full use of his lungs and a story about the surgeon who had saved his life under impossible conditions. Sergeant Collins would recover completely from his internal injuries and credit Dr. Chen with giving him a second chance at life. The other wounded soldiers would carry similar stories, and Dr. Chen's reputation would spread throughout the military medical community. But perhaps most importantly, Colonel Brennan would never again make assumptions about personnel based on their appearance or his preconceived notions about what professionals should look like. The lesson had been expensive, nearly costing lives, that were saved only by Dr. Chen's extraordinary competence. But it was a lesson that would make him a better commander and a better judge of the people who served under him. The sun was setting over Forward Operating Base Hammurabi as normal operations resumed throughout the compound. Guard rotations changed, equipment was repaired, and reports were filed documenting the day's events. But in the medical aid station, Dr. Chen continued her work with the same quiet competence that had characterized her service from the moment she had stepped off the helicopter that morning. She had proven herself beyond any doubt, earned the respect of everyone who had witnessed her performance, and demonstrated what real professionalism looked like under the most challenging conditions imaginable. But for Dr. Chen, it had just been another day of doing the job she had trained for, serving the soldiers who depended on her expertise, and living up to the standards she had set for herself throughout her military career. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.